This is a 1999 Nissan Skyline GT-R, the R34 GT-R, and I want it. Bad. Everyone does who grew up in the 1990s because this car was the ultimate performance car in so many video games, and we could never have it here in America. Well, this one's here, it's legal, and today I'm going to review it and show you all the quirks and features of the R34 GT-R. Before I get started, big news, this R34 GT-R is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This GT-R is a V-spec model finished in beautiful midnight purple, and it is legally imported to the United States under the show or display rule, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to go to the live auction for this R34 Skyline GT-R, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the R34 Skyline GT-R with a little overview of what makes this car so special. So, the Skyline GT-R first came out in the late 60s and the early 70s, and it was a high-performance version of Nissan's regular mid-size Skyline model, much like a lot of American muscle cars were high-performance versions of regular American cars at the same time. Now, the Skyline GT-R name went away for almost 20 years, but Nissan revived it in 1989 to create the R32 Skyline GT-R, the first modern era GT-R. In 94, it was updated to become the R33 GT-R, but the big dog, unquestionably the most iconic and special of the bunch, is this model, the R34, which came out in 99, was sold through 2002. Now, this was the last Skyline GT-R. A few years after this went out of production, Nissan came out with the new GT-R, but it wasn't the same thing. It wasn't quite based on a Skyline in the same way. It was effectively a totally new ground-up vehicle, unlike this. And it wasn't as rare or as special or as forbidden as this car, since these were never sold in the United States, and the new GT-R was. Over the years, the R34 GT-R dominated so many car video games that came out of Japan, like Gran Turismo. It had a legend that just grew and grew and grew. Now, part of the reason for the GT-R's legendary status is the powertrain. This is the RB26 twin-turbo six-cylinder, a famous engine among performance cars. It was used in all of the later Skyline GT-Rs. The R32, 33, and 34 used it, and here it was rated at 276 horsepower. I say that with a little uncertainty because back in the 90s, in order to combat street racing and horsepower escalation and to promote a safer driving atmosphere, the Japanese car companies got together and decided that all their performance cars would have 276 horsepower. Didn't matter if it was a 3000 GT or a Skyline GT-R, 300ZX, they were all 276, even though actual numbers were higher. I had an R32 Skyline GT-R with this powertrain, mostly unmodified, and I dynoed that at about 320 horsepower. A lot of people think the R34 made even more, but officially it was 276. And regardless, the stock factory horsepower wasn't the thing that made this engine so special. It was the tunability. These cars have an enormous aftermarket devoted to tuning, and they commonly get over 1,000 horsepower on the stock engine, and then they blow up and people rebuild them because that's just what you do with GT-Rs. This particular GT-R is unusual because it's largely unmodified. Most people over the last 25 years found it hard to resist the temptation of more power. Now, from 99 to 02, when the R34 GT-R was in production, Nissan only made about 11,500 of them, so they're pretty rare. And this particular one is a V-spec model, which stood for Victory Spec. The V-spec is actually the most common of the bunch. There's a little over 4,000 of these R34 GT-R V-spec models, but it was the one you wanted because it had some great upgrades over the standard Skyline GT-R. Probably the biggest upgrade was an active rear lip limited slip differential, which helped you for handling and performance driving on the racetrack. And although all R34 GT-Rs had all-wheel drive, the V-spec models had an upgraded, tuned all-wheel drive they called the Pro system that also helped to improve handling. Other V-spec benefits included stiffer suspension, again for better handling, and some cosmetic upgrades. In front, you had a front splitter, which gave it a more aggressive look, and in back, you had a rear diffuser, again an upgrade over the standard non-V-spec Skyline GT-R. One other very cool thing about this particular car is its color. It's finished in midnight purple. That's what they called it, and this was a factory color, and this is a factory midnight purple Skyline GT-R. It's an amazing color that basically shifts in the light. It's usually purple, but sometimes it can look green or blue or even red depending on exactly where you're looking at it. Gorgeous paint flakes. It's an absolutely breathtakingly beautiful color. In my mind, just as iconic as the famous Bayside blue that these cars are also known for. Midnight purple, very, very special. But anyway, next up, let's talk through the quirks and features of the R34 GT-R, starting on the outside and starting in back with those taillights. An absolutely iconic design. The 4 circles, the 2 on the outside, larger than the 2 on the inside. It was incredibly well known by everybody who played video games in the 90s. The camera was always right above the car from the back. You were looking at those taillights, just thinking about how fast this car was and how you couldn't have it in America. Of course, you also see the iconic GT-R badge back here, GT over the red R, which meant business. Even the trunk line in this car is kind of iconic just because of its sort of weird shape that curved around the taillights. Everything about the rear of this car is special, well-known, and unique to the R34 GT-R. Now, moving down the side, this car still has its factory wheels, which is rare. So many people upgraded, at least in their minds, the wheels on these cars, but I always loved the way the factory wheels look. They were subtle, understated, but still performance-y and exciting. Behind the factory wheels, you have gold brake calipers. This car used Brembo brakes with these distinctive gold calipers that contrast kind of nicely with midnight purple. It looks very cool. Also worth pointing out, in back, these cars had rear wheel steering. You didn't have to get the V-spec to get it. All R34 GT-Rs, in fact, I think all modern Skyline GT-Rs had rear wheel steering to help, again, enhance the car's handling prowess. Also worth pointing out in back is the rear wing, which is similarly iconic to the rest of the rear end. It's huge, massive perch there on the trunk, and it meant business compared to the regular, standard, everyday Skyline models. The rear wing is also adjustable. The little flap on the end, you can see, has a couple of positions. You got to do it with tools. You can't just press a button inside the car, but it is adjustable if you wanted to change your downforce experience. Now, moving up front in the R34 GT-R, I always loved the front end design of this car, far more than the R32 and R33, which I never thought were really all that aggressive. They looked nice, but I always thought they looked too fun, too eager to please, happy-go-lucky, not aggressive enough for a car like this. The R34 remedied that. The headlights narrow as they go into the center, the grille is bigger, the front end just means business, more aggressive than previous models. I always thought it looked amazing. And I like that the GT-R badge is front and center in the grille. Nissan didn't bother with its Nissan branding on this car. If you knew, you knew. It just said GT-R. In fact, the only Nissan badge, the entire exterior of this car is in the center of the trunk in back. Otherwise, it was all GT-R. Even the wheel caps, just GT-R in here. They didn't bother with that Nissan stuff. People knew the GT-R. And by the way, speaking of the rear and that badging back there, one other interesting item in the back of the R34 GT-R, it has a rear wiper, which you never really see on cars with a trunk, but some performance cars from Japan in this era had them. They had all-wheel drive, and I think the goal was an all-weather performance car, and so a rear wiper helped underscore that it was capable of being exactly that. Unusual unusual to see on a car with this body style. And next up, we move inside the R34 GT-R. Although just getting inside, I want to start with the key, which is pretty cool. Regular metal key. It says GT-R in the top, which looks neat. And it's paired with a key fob, like a lot of cars from this era, a remote for lock and unlock. You flip that over and it also has the GT-R logo on it. Even the fob was GT-R branded. But climb inside and you can see this is a right-hand drive car. No surprise. The primary market for this car was Japan, which is of course a right-hand drive country, and Nissan never made any left-hand drive Skyline GT-Rs. They only sold these in right-hand drive countries, mainly Japan, but also Australia, New Zealand, the UK, a few other markets that were all right-hand drive, so this is the only way you could get these. But anyway, moving further into the interior, most enthusiasts, when they come in contact with the inside of an R34 GT-R, they're surprised by how, well, basic it is. Not exactly basic, but regular. The exterior of this car is such an icon, and it totally takes your breath away to see one, especially for Americans who most of us haven't seen one. Then the power and performance is so incredible, the tunability, the massive horsepower these can make. But when you get inside, it almost doesn't seem to match up with the iconic status of the rest of this car. In fact, it looks a lot like a late 90s Nissan in here. Although you do have a couple of interesting items that are Skyline GT-R unique. One is the manual transmission. 6-speed manual in this car. It's the only way they came. They never offered these with an automatic, so you had a mandatory 6-speed. Now next, you look at the gauge cluster and you can see that the tachometer goes to 10,000 RPM. Now redline kicks in at 8,000, but still, I don't think a lot of other late 90s Nissans had tachs that went to 10. Hilariously, the speedometer only goes to 180 kilometers an hour, which translates to about 110 miles per hour. Japan in this era was really focused on keeping speeds down, keeping the roads safe, and so they did stuff like limit speedometers as if anybody thought that was going to limit people's speeds, but that was one of the actions they took, and so this massive, crazy performance car only has 110 mile an hour speedometer. Now another big change in here compared to regular Nissan models from this era, the seats. You have these tightly bolstered sport seats with holes in the backrest for a racing seat belt if you wanted to, and no leather here. Instead you had this cloth with dots pattern that was meant to provide a little more friction than a standard seat and keep you in place on the racetrack. These seats obviously very different from what you had in a Maxima. Now, the other really interesting thing that the R34 GT-R had that other Skyline GT-R models didn't is this screen mounted on the dashboard at the top in the center. This mainly gave you performance readouts, instant readouts of all sorts of different measures of vehicle health that you might be interested in if you're drag racing or racing at the track or just tuning your car. You can get readouts instantaneously on this screen, various different things far beyond what a normal person driving a car would want. And there's a couple quirky things you can do with this screen. For one, there's an area labeled red zone that you go in and it shows you the maximums of various different readouts for this car, but they are adjustable. So if you've tuned this car and you know you can make more boost pressure, well, you can dial up the maximum so it won't give you a warning, and that's true with various other items as well. An interesting idea. You can also adjust the red line. Well, not actually, but you can adjust where the car tells you to upshift because it's hitting the red line. If you've done some tuning and you know you can bring your engine higher or you just want to, your red line warning can be adjusted so it won't kill your fun prematurely. Also worth pointing out that this screen has a button marked TV. You push it and nothing happens, but I do wonder if there's a TV transmitter built in that would have worked in Japan. That's something that you actually see somewhat frequently in Japanese cars, especially from this era. A TV built in somewhere. It was such an electronic focused culture that wouldn't be totally out of place, and it's interesting to see that there. Now, speaking of screens in this car, you will also note that lower down in the center control stack there is another screen. This one obviously aftermarket, and it's used to control your music. You can hook up a music player to this, and this is how you control it. The factory head unit has been replaced with this improved unit. Now, also worth pointing out in this interior, a couple of small things. In the center you have cup holders. Lift up this flap and they're there, but they are small. small. Same deal with the center storage area. You lift up the armrest and there's storage, but once again, it is unusually small. The rest of this stuff in this interior, though, is largely late 90s, early 2000s Nissan, which means that it's durable, usable, reliable. It's lasted for a long time without scratches or fading, but it's not especially a standout. No iconic interior design in here to match the exterior. You even have this little diagram on the side of the steering column that explains the position of the lighting stalk, the turn signals, the high beams, all that stuff. You can't see this diagram, but Nissan put it on all of their models for a long time, apparently including the Skyline GT-R, because driving enthusiasts who bought this car needed to be educated about how to use their turn signals. By the way, also in this vicinity below that stalk, you have this panel which opens up, revealing a storage area where someone left their glasses. This is a little hidden compartment, so I bet those glasses have been in this car since Japan. If you owned this car in Japan, we have your glasses. Send us a note, cars and bids, we'll get them back to you, no problem. Now, also interesting to see in this car, it has back seats for a little added practicality. Only 2 seats back there, as you can see. There's no center seat, and they're surprisingly well bolstered also, just like the front seats. I guess they figured if you had rear passengers, you might be taking them on the racetrack, so they didn't want you to slide around. And you have the same dot cloth friction material, again, for that purpose, to keep you from sliding around in the seats as you're doing hard G-forces and cornering. Beyond that, nothing really interesting about the back seats. They're totally no frills, but they are there in case you wanted to use your Skyline GT-R for family transport. And next up, we move on to the cargo area in the R34 GT-R, the trunk, which you open it with a little key fob, or there's a lever inside, and, well, frankly, it's just a fairly standard trunk. You can see decent size, so you got some practicality in this car, but nothing unusual or special or interesting in here, although I did find one thing that was amusing. You have hydraulic struts for this trunk. You don't normally see that in car trunks. Usually just the hinge and gravity is enough to keep them open, but in this car, you have a massive rear wing, and with that thing on there adding weight, I guess Nissan figured they needed to add some hydraulic struts to keep the trunk up when you're loading and unloading. So, the last thing to discuss is exactly how this car is here. Most people know you can't legally import a car to the United States unless it's 25 years old. That's generally true, but there are a few exceptions. One of those exceptions is called show or display. This is a regulation that's aimed at making sure that certain very historically significant special cars can be imported before they turn 25 for show or display purposes. We want to see the cool stuff, and so there's an exemption for very special cars. You have to qualify. You can't just import whatever and say show or display. There's a list that the government keeps of very special cars that qualify, and this, the R34 GT-R V-spec, is on the list, and this car is a show or display exempt vehicle, which puts it here legally. Now, the only drawback to show or display is a mileage limit. 2,500 miles a year is your maximum. But for most people, that's about all they drive special show or display type cars, and it's better to have a mileage limit and have the car here than no mileage limit and no car. So this is here legally with show or display. All right, driving the R34 GT-R, and the simple truth is I love this car. I love to drive it. You know, this car is overrated, like by definition. It's just got so much lore around it, and it's become so valuable, and it almost can't not be overrated. But when you're sitting in it behind the wheel and you're going, it's so good. I mean, it's just excellent. Couple things that really make this car special. The powertrain is really one of them. You know, everybody talks about how tunable this powertrain is. You can get 1,000 horsepower and blah, 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 and people are doing that, but I think this powertrain is great stock. 330 horsepower, give or take, is like the right number for so many cars. I felt that for so long. I say that in videos from 10 years ago. And it feels like the right number in this car. It seems really quick, but it's not like aggressively, absurdly so where you can't have fun. And the engine is eager. You don't have to be too high in the rev range to give it some good acceleration, and you get going. Now, it doesn't sound amazing, this engine, at least in stock form, but it has all the good stuff. It's quick, it's reliable in an untuned state, really reliable. It's a robust engine. That's why people can get 1,000 horsepower out of them. And it's good. The other important thing that makes this car so good is the way that it steers and handles. The really great thing about the R34 GT-R is the steering feel. It is precise, it is tight, it is quick in a way that virtually no other cars from this era are. My buddy Kenan, who's been in a couple of my videos, he's got a Ferrari 355. That car is older than this one, so you think, okay, the hydraulic steering era feels even more connected. This car feels super connected. The steering is just immediate and precise. Real exotic performance cars from this era. I owned a Ferrari 360. They did not feel as precise and as quick to steer as this car. It's not a purpose-built mid-engine exotic sports car like a Ferrari, but it steers better than one. Okay, so the drawbacks. Price is obviously one of them. This car is going to sell for over $200,000. That is a ridiculous amount of money for a late 90s Nissan. Even though this is a very special late 90s Nissan, it is big money for a late 90s Nissan, no doubt about it. But this car, of all the 90s Japanese sports cars, there were so many, the Supras, the 300ZXs, 3000 GTs, this car has gained the status, even over the NSX, of being the one, the most iconic, the most desirable car from this era. And it's got a lot of things going for it. It wasn't available here, so it has this sort of wow factor. It's incredibly low production. And it's like the end of a special era, the last of the Skyline GT-Rs, the last vehicle made like this. It's special on so many levels. The interior is a drawback. It's not bad in here, but it's not like special, as I've mentioned. The exterior is special, the performance is special, the feel of the car is special, the interior is not special. Other than that, this is just awesome. This car was so cool. And I hate to feed into the hype of these things because they've gotten crazily hyped. And I think the values are just so out of control, but when you really think about what this car is and what it meant to like a generation of car enthusiasts begging for a lot of cars that we couldn't get in America to come to America, and this is the one we wanted the most. We eventually got the WRX, we got the Evo, the European cars all eventually came, but this car was the one everybody wanted. And now there's a few of them trickling over, and it just is so cool. Driving this car around, people just freak, and with good reason. It's just a really special car that, whether you like it or not, is going to come to define this generation. The video game kids who grew up in the 90s and early 2000s will be defined by their love of this car. And now that these cars are becoming legal, it's going to be special, and that's what it is. And the good news is it's actually great to drive. This isn't a don't meet your heroes car where it's not actually enjoyable. It's still fun to drive. One other drawback, by the way, one thing I don't love is right-hand drive. A lot of people get used to it, and for this car you got no other choice, although there have been some left-hand drive conversions. But in my mind, I've never been a fan of driving right-hand drive. It's just a little difficult to do. But this car is just so cool, and it deserves all the accolades that people say about it, even though they say a lot. And so that's the R34 Nissan Skyline GT-R. This car is amazing. It's a childhood dream, and I absolutely love it. I love driving it. I love looking at it. Everything about this car is so special, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this R34 GT-R a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 60 out of 100, which places the R34 GT-R here against contemporary rivals, right near the top. In the end, this car is just plain cool. Absolutely revered by a generation of car enthusiasts as the ultimate Japanese car, which it basically was. It's fun to drive, sure, fast and tunable, and it handles great, but really this car's big selling point is that it's just a seriously amazing icon, one of the all-time automotive greats. As a bonus, it drives pretty damn well too.